It is 9:30. Welcome back to this. Oh, I forgot the most important person. Actually, you're still right on time. It's still 9:30. Okay, you ready? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tam Doduck. Welcome back to the Water Right Chains petition hearing for the California WaterFix project. To my right is board member Didi Diadamo. I expect we'll be joined sometime today by board chair and co-hearing officer Felicia Marcus. To my left is Connie Mittenhofer, and I believe is Jean staying or not? Okay, Connie Mittenhofer. We're being assisted today by Ms. Galen, and welcome to the Sierra hearing room. Since we are in a new location, sort of, please take a moment and identify the exit closest to you. In the event of an emergency, an alarm will sound. We will evacuate using the stairs, not the elevators, down to the first floor. If you're not able to use the stairs, flag some of the security people. It occurred to me that on my floor, they wear orange fluorescent colored clothing. I don't know what color they wear on this floor, but they will be wearing vests and caps. So flag down one of them and they will direct you to a protective area. Don't flag me down because I'm not sure where one is. Second announcement is that, as always, this is being webcasted and recorded, so speak into the microphone and begin by stating your name and affiliation. Our court reporter, Debbie, today is with us, and please make arrangements with her directly if you wish to have copies of the transcript sooner than when we would make it available, which will be at the end of part 2. And as always, most importantly, and I know Mr. Herrick has already taken care of this, please take a moment and put all your noise-making devices on silent, vibrate, do not disturb. In addition, for my benefit, it's also with respect to all the witnesses appearing here today, as well as the attorneys who are cross-examining them. All right. Housekeeping matter. First of all, a note of thanks to the staff who was able to get the AV working in this room so that we didn't have to go into the gigantic Byron Share auditorium. Any other housekeeping matters? Mr. Keeling.
Yes, thank you, Tom Keeling for the San Joaquin County Protestants. The hearing officers generously accommodated my request a few weeks back to have Supervisor Miller give her policy statement on one of the county panels, which is fine, but I noticed that the revised schedule that came out yesterday had assumed that we had meant, the panel that went yesterday. No, that we have.
You haven't.
Okay, so that would, we plan on doing that at the panel, the transportation panel, and if she is in an emergency session, we'll do it with the one with Mr. Del Piero later. And
all right.
I hope that's okay.
That's okay.
Thank you.
You waived your opening statement yesterday, not
yes,
the policy
that's
statement.
fine.
Okay. Ms. Desjardins, is the microphone on?
Apologies. Nikki Sward with Snug Harbor Resorts was watching the testimony yesterday, and she had some questions about impacts on recreational businesses and hers in particular. But she wasn't able to make it. She did send an email requesting that I ask questions. If that's granted, it'd be about 15 minutes.
We did receive that email, and since she is number 41, she'll come after you. So after you conduct your cross, you may do so for her as well. Mr. Ferguson.
Good morning, Aaron Ferguson, County of Sacramento. I wanted to try to pick up where I left off at the very end of the day yesterday.
Now that you have the latest version?
Yes, I do have the latest version, and even still, I wanted to present a request. In what is now the 5th group that includes the county, there's a panel with Supervisor Natoli and many other witnesses. And then there's a Yolo County panel with 3 Yolo County landowners. I'm having some challenges with the Natoli panel in terms of potentially being up Friday. Yolo County has agreed to switch the order there and go ahead of the County of Sacramento panel, if that's agreeable. It's within that group still. That works for you. And DWR and the water contractors had no issue with that, so.
All right. And should we finish with the third panel, the YOLO panel, early on Friday, your witnesses would still not be available?
I'll get as many of them here as I can.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll do what we can, but hopefully it pushes over into Monday.
Or you can try to make arrangements with EB Mudd.
I could try.
Oh,
Yeah.
but I guess Ms. Ainsley is about.
Yeah, I was trying not to complicate things too
Okay.
much.
All right. I will leave it to you guys that we will, for now, switch the second and third panels for the group that is in the 5th order of presentation.
Okay, I very much appreciate it. The second item is, I was just made aware yesterday on the transportation panel that Mr. Keeling mentioned. The County of Sacramento has a witness, Mr. Mogizi. He has a family medical issue, which makes it so that he's not going to be in the office from this Friday through the following Friday. He's going to be available again on March 26th. I'm proposing to potentially move him down as a solo witness, say right before CSPA, which is about the 12th group. I've conferred with all the parties in between there. I think I've heard from all but one party, perhaps, that they're okay with that. I'm just trying to push him out to at least the 26th or later.
Who are we talking about?
Reza Mogisi, he's in the 5th group, first panel. And so I'm proposing he appear as a solo witness later in the order of presentation.
No objections?
And I'll submit a letter today.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Jackson?
Yes, I thought I ought to bring this up as soon as I could. I have a witness for CSPA and that group in the final panel. I have 2 witnesses, actually. One is Mark Del Piero, and the other is Ed Whitelaw. Mr. Whitelaw is in...
Sorry, don't you have Felix Smith, too?
I do,
Okay.
but Felix lives here locally and is not a problem. Mr. Whitelaw has broken 5 bones, 3 ribs. He's going to need a complete hip replacement from a fall that took place as he was coming out of a courthouse in a different state. So I'm having a little trouble with the scheduling. I asked Ms. Womack if she would be willing to exchange my 4th panel with her, and I have not had a chance yet to talk to DWR or anyone else who might object, but
let's
he
perhaps-
cannot travel at this
Perhaps
point.
we can simplify this. We made the same arrangement to accommodate Dr. Rosenfeld from the NRDC group, who had also a significant health issue, and we just moved him to the end of the order. Would anyone object to us just moving Dr. Ed Whitelaw now to the end of the order of presentation after Dr. Rosenfeld?
Uh,
And just to clarify, we're talking about just Dr. Whitelaw, just so I'm
Well,
making clear notes.
the second thing is that we've been notified that Mark Del Piero is going in for a cervical fusion on the 9th. And his doctor says he
Not a
will,
medical doctor, all these terms.
he will not. It's also that we're pretty old out here. I mean, if
So, Mr. Jackson.
So
let
I
me-
would like to move that whole panel, if I could, to either Ms. Womack's position or the same position as Dr. Rosenfield.
I will propose that we move this entire 3rd panel for Group 31, appearing in right now, Order 12, to the end of the order to testify after Dr. Rosenfeld.
Thank you.
All right, so you're talking about that would be the fourth panel of
I'm sorry, yes, the fourth panel, Del Puro,
Whitelaw, and Felix Smith would be moved roughly around Rosenfeld at the end.
at the end. Right now, is it Rosenfeld the last one, or have we made more changes? Yes, Rosenfeld is the last one, so now those three will be after Rosenfeld.
And I understand that the parties will move their evidence into the record at the end of their cases in chief, so then you will move your evidence into the record
For all
at the
the panels.
conclusion of
Yes.
the fourth panel. Okay, I'm just making sure that I take
Correct.
clear notes. I think that that's fine with us for that fourth panel.
All right?
I really want to thank DWR for that and the Bureau, and thank you.
Thank you. My best to Dr. Whitelaw, but especially to Mark Del Puro, who was a State Water Board member as well. Thank you. Right. Any other housekeeping matter? All right. Oh, I was asked to announce, not that you need to have more energy, but there are donut holes in the back if you feel like you need a sugar rush. And also, if you did not receive a copy, the latest, which has now been changed again, order presentation for part 2, copies are in the back. All right, with that, we will now turn to Mr. Jackson for his cross-examination. Oh, Ms. Meserve?
Good morning, OSHA Meserve for Land et al. Before Mr. Jackson begins, there was a question regarding a figure yesterday and whether it was in or out of evidence that I think would be best to resolve now. If there's detailed discussion about it, obviously we should probably just revert to written briefing rather than take up more time, but I think I can clarify at least one of the figures based on my
Are
review.
you talking about Land 3?
Yes, I am. As was mentioned yesterday, Land 3, which is cited in many of the Part 1 testimonies submitted by Land, as well as the Part 2 testimonies, there was a ruling denying reconsideration of bringing that figure, along with a couple others, on March 21st. In that same ruling, the chair, the hearing officers suggested that this could be the subject of rebuttal testimony. And so indeed on March 23rd, I did submit rebuttal testimony of Mr. Eric Ringelberg, under whom these figures were prepared under his direction at BSK Associates. Then on May 19th of 2017, Mr. Ringelberg brought forth that testimony. There were no questions for Mr. Ringelberg, and on that same day, that evidence was moved into, those figures were moved into evidence. And in particular, that's May 19th, page 73 of the transcript. So with respect to Land 3, I believe that is resolved. Now, with respect to Land 1...
Thank you for looking into that. So many exhibits.
Yes, it took a little while, but I did track it down because I knew that was already done. Now, Land 3 is a more close-up version.
Sorry, not 3. We just talked 3, right?
Yes.
Okay. You still on 3?
I am transitioning
Okay.
to Land 1.
I've had too much sugar this morning.
I only had one donut hole so far. So Land 3 is a close-up into the intake area and the refuge. Land 120, which is cited in several of the Part 2 witnesses' testimony, is a zoom-out view of using the very same GIS data by BSK Associates prepared in February of 2016, and that can be seen by zooming into the legend on the map. So if there are objections to Land 120 based on reliability or anything else, I guess that would still be open. But I guess I question why it would be necessary to bring Mr. Ringelberg in again to describe the same process of using DWR's own GIS data to create a map that, to my knowledge, throughout all these proceedings, there has never been one question or allegation regarding the inaccuracy, and it is also marked as to scale, except where not, and it's up to professional standards in terms of map making. So we could go into that with Land 120. I would suggest that it should not be necessary since it's part of the same set of maps prepared by the same firm using the same methods described in Land 80, which is the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Ringelberg.
Ms. Ainsley?
I think that my only comments at this time are that I'm happy to check about Land 3, and that's fine. I'm sure the board's attorneys will check too. In terms of Land 20, I do object.
120.
Land 120. I'm sorry, I do object to testimony provided by Ms. Meserve as to the foundation and contents of Land 120. If and when I bring an objection to Land 20, I expect that she will, answer the objection, and then if she has to put on rebuttal testimony because her witnesses here can't authenticate the document, that's fine. That's the proper procedure in the normal course. I do object to her here herself presenting evidence as to the contents of Land 120, which was our problem in the Part 1. So we can resolve that in the normal course of evidentiary objections.
But as of now, you have not made an objection with respect to Land 120.
Well, her witnesses are still on the panel. I have asked her witnesses questions regarding Land 120, and I may make an objection to the admission of evidence into evidence of Land 120.
But as of this moment, there is not an objection.
I can make that objection now.
No,
I just thought you
no.
didn't want them. Oh.
I just want to make sure before we get into another back and forth on this exhibit.
I'm saying I'm happy to leave that to the normal course.
All right.
If I understood Ms. Ainsley correctly, it was that the time for objecting to exhibits introduced on cross is, okay.
That's right.
No more donut holes.
I wanted to read from Government Code 11513, which governs this Code 11513.
Ms. Desjardins, what is this in relation to?
In relation to what she just said,
Who just said?
Ms. Ainsley.
We are not discussing that right now. She's not making any objection right now. She will, if she chooses, make an objection when these exhibits are moved into the record. There is no further discussion on an objection that has not been made.
Just generally,
No,
I
thank
lodge
you.
an objection
No,
to
thank
objections
you.
based on lack of foundation.
She
based
has
on evidence
not,
code.
she has
Government Code
not filed an
11513C.
objection. Place it down. Please pay closer attention to the proceedings as they reveal themselves and make your objections at the appropriate time. Please, that goes for everybody. All right, I think we're finally ready to turn to Mr. Jackson, who has reminded me several times that he is aging during this hearing process. So let's not keep him waiting any further. Mr. Jackson, is your microphone on?
Oh, excuse me. The two areas that I wanted to talk to Dr. Schilling about would be his testimony at Land 135, if that could be put up. And the other will be a document CSPA number 26, which is the Delta Reform Act code sections.
It appears the chair has a soft heart for you, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you.
You're not old enough, apparently.
And I did miss breakfast. Could you go to page 2, lines 12 to 20? Dr. Schilling, you indicate in lines 12, 20, some of your background on water quality and quantity conditions in roadways, in waterways, social uses of fisheries in the Delta and throughout California, and the impacts of transportation infrastructure on fish and wildlife. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
Is that sort of a summary of the issues that you looked at in your overall testimony?
I think I extended a little beyond this because I talked about two processes really at the state scale. One is thinking about sustainability, which is in statute and policy, and the other is regional water management, which is in statute and policy and funding mechanisms. So those were also part of it. And then transportation infrastructure has been my primary field of study, but really any construction impacts and linear features that humans create on the landscape are all related to that and are part of the same area. Often the same papers will look at those things together.
So
Hold on, Mr. Jackson. Let me ask Dr. Schilling to move the microphone closer.
Yes,
We
sorry.
can hear you just fine. Well, maybe not Mr. Herrick, but because he was nodding his head. But for the webcasting viewing
Okay,
audience.
is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
in looking at the areas in which you've worked in California, is it fair to say that they are areas that are either part of the Central Valley watershed that leads into the Delta, or areas in which water is used from the Delta? I do know that the Los Angeles and San Gabriel rivers don't run to the Delta, but they're in areas in which water is used. Is it fair to say that?
Yes, it's fair to say that.
And how many years have you been doing Central Valley related work in the areas that you are testifying?
Well, starting in '98 and fairly continuously since then in different parts of the Central Valley, sometimes as part of a statewide assessment and sometimes but part of the Central Valley itself, such as the Sacramento River.
All right. Did you, in doing this, your work over those years in the Central Valley watershed, did you have occasion to spend time in the Delta?
Yes.
How much time?
Well, recreationally, the odd misspent weekend at the sugar mill, old sugar mill. I've done field work along the Sacramento River through the Delta, some roadways, the lower Delta into the Sassoon Marsh, both work and recreation. It's hard to say. It's not an everyday thing, but certainly every year thing since over the last 20 years.
And it's not so far from your home in Winters?
No, and my home used to be in Davis until last year, so. Yeah. And I can't hear those pile driver strikes yet, so if that was you.
The in your work, did you attempt to determine impacts of projects on environmental conditions?
That's generally true of most of my research is studying human impacts and our activities on natural conditions, yes.
Did you also look at whole ecosystems for cumulative impacts?
Yes.
And is there a difference between direct impacts and cumulative impacts in a watershed the size of the San Francisco, San Joaquin Delta watershed?
Yeah, definitely. There's most projects are studied from a single impact point of view, although there is law to require a cumulative impacts point of view. And most environmental scientists and ecologists and hydrologists and other, we think of these things as whole systems. Sorry. Ecologists, environmental scientists think of these as systems that have many moving parts that operate together. And so in the real world, that's an accumulation of processes and attributes of a system. And so single projects or very large projects can have multiple effects some of which are independent of each other, and some of which have a synergistic effect, and you can have an even worse outcome than if you were to add up the individual impacts of those.
Did you do both for this process and this testimony, an analysis of direct and cumulative impacts?
I looked at the individual impacts and considered those in the context of the literature, and then also thought about the accumulation of all of the impacts, whether or not they're mitigated, and that informed, for example, the sustainability part of the testimony or the regional planning part of the testimony. So yes.
Next, could we go to page 4, line 17, in land 135? Now, some impacts have human impacts as well as species impacts, do they not?
Yeah, if you mean non-human species,
Right.
yeah.
So calling your attention to in the environmental impacts at line 16 that are potentially present. Direct mortality for amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. Would you explain for me what kind of direct impacts you would expect from a project of this size in that location?
Sure. So one is that as you increase the amount of traffic or the extent of roadways or the use of existing roadways in an area where you have wildlife, which is most of the, or all of the delta, there's a predictable increase in the mortality of wildlife immediately nearby because they're trying to cross the road. So the colloquial term is roadkill, and for some of these groups, there's a direct relationship between increasing traffic and increasing mortality. For some of them, they'll avoid roads, and that's the noise impact that I discussed. But for others, they may just cross the road regardless because they don't see it as a threat. And so it varies by these groups, but I'm not sure there's any amphibian that's sensitive to roads as a source of mortality. There are some reptiles that respond to roads and avoid them. There are some mammals that avoid roads, but others that just try to cross, so it varies quite a bit. But the direct mortality effect is partially from roads and traffic.
Could you bring up, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, I don't mean to be rude.
Ms. Galen.
Ms. Galen, I'll remember. Could you bring up CSPA number 26, please? And I'm looking for section 85022, which is near the front, and C 1. Are you familiar with this section of the Delta Reform Act?
Well, I'm familiar with the Delta Reform Act and this language, generally speaking, yes.
So given your experience living near the Delta and working in the Delta in your areas of expertise, does 85022C1, do you agree with the statement by the legislature about the Delta?
Yes.
What is your view of why the delta is distinct and valuable?
Well, most large estuaries are fairly readily identified as a distinct and separate place from their watershed and from the coastline that they feed to. And it has its own set of unique processes and attributes that are not true of anywhere else around it. So it's unique in a geographic sense, in a biological, ecological sense. It's going to have unique, and it does have unique wildlife and plants and wildlife-plant interactions and nutrient processes. All of those things are nutrient cycling processes. So the unique part of it, from a natural point of view, because of its size and its position and the size of its watershed, it's got a special ecological place, and it's unique in the literal sense in that there's not anything else like it. So culturally, I'm aware that people think of it as a place that it has an enduring meaning in California history and culture, and apparently a lot from the witnesses here has that kind of meaning. But also politically, it's had a long history of both accords, agreements, and discord and disagreement. And it's probably unique in that sense too, and why the legislature would create the Delta Reform Act, which has driven a lot of the protection of the Delta, but also the various funding mechanisms that have identified the Delta for specific amounts of funding. And because we're taking so much out of it, I think is the problem, out of something that's irreplaceable, and therefore threatening that uniqueness that you brought up.
I'll go a little out of order because of your response. Do you agree that with number 3, C3, which is that it is necessary to protect and enhance the ecosystem of the Delta and prevent its further deterioration and destruction?
In order to do the first part?
In
Do I
order
agree
to
that we should do that? I agree we should do that, but the statement there is to promote public safety, health, and welfare, and to protect public and private property, wildlife, and fisheries. We would do what you just said. And yes, I agree that if we hold those things as values, then we have to do the latter. We have to protect and enhance the ecosystem, because we won't get the public benefits, whatever people derive from the Delta as an intact system, if we disentangle it, if we deteriorate it and destroy it.
Could you scroll up just a little bit, because I'm having trouble seeing over Andrew, and I don't want to misquote anything. No, it's fine. Just a little more so I can see 4 and 5. Okay. Do you agree that in 85022C4, in the legislature's findings in the Delta Reform Act, that it makes sense from a planning purpose that that we look at planning in the Delta in a coordinated fashion for both species and people?
Yes.
Have you had experience doing that in anything of this size before?
When you say anything of this size, what do you mean?
Any ecological system any estuary that has this amount of species, area, importance.
You mean, is there something analogous elsewhere in the world, or have I had direct experience with?
Is there anything analogous that you know of on the west coast of the Americas, for instance?
No, not on the West Coast. And throughout the world, I think there's a couple of examples, but we probably.
And what would they be?
The Chesapeake Bay, coordinated planning, multi-state, many jurisdictions, and related originally to a US EPA requirement to reduce nutrient loading to the Chesapeake Bay because it was having destructive effects. That's somewhat similar, or quite similar. It's got a lot of differences, but in terms of having a requirement for a lot of coordination, a lot of consideration of needs and interests of different jurisdictions, and then having coordinated actions that result in the benefit to that bay.
In the Chesapeake Bay situation, to your knowledge, was there an infrastructure project proposed of this size?
There was not a single infrastructure project proposed of this size, no.
Ainsley, hold on, Mr. Jackson.
I want to object to his lack of foundation. He hasn't established that he actually worked in the Chesapeake or that he analyzed impacts. I guess he's asking generally if he's aware of a project that occurred in the vicinity of the Chesapeake Bay.
What is your familiarity with the Chesapeake Bay project?
Well, as part of involvement in CBDA and everything pre-CalFed and since then, that was one of our big models. There's been a couple of big models in understanding how very large watershed and coastal estuary systems should be planned for from an impacts and solutions point of view. As we got into the drought in southern Australia. When I say we, I mean there's multiple agencies and academics that have been involved, obviously in the Delta over the last 20 years, and that. So there's a couple of global models for how we should do a better job, and Chesapeake Bay was one of those, and it has come up consistently as a good model, or a model for some parts of coordinated planning.
So you didn't work on the project, but you're familiar with it?
Yes, yeah.
All right, to stay within my promise, I'll go to number 2 at the top. Would you read that? And then I have a couple of questions about it.
Okay.
You don't need to read it out loud. I think everybody can see it.
Okay.
The legislative finding in 85022C2 talks about the permanent protection of the Delta, and it talks about natural and scenic resources. So are scenic resources human resources?
Yeah, I think that you could characterize them that way.
Ms. Ainsley, my understanding, Mr. Jackson was asking Dr. Schilling for his understanding.
Yes.
Overruled.
So reading it from a colloquial or environmental policy point of view, scenic resources sounds like something that people appreciating a view or aspects of a built or natural environment in an aesthetic way.
What is your understanding of the word paramount in 85002C2?
The primary, the leading concern.
In your review of the information that you put into your testimony in Land 135, did you see, when you reviewed the environmental documents to prepare for this case, did you see any way in which the proposed Cal WaterFix would indicate that that the natural and scenic resources are paramount?
No.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. As Ms. Desjardins comes up and get ready for cross-examination, could someone please go in the hallway and ask Ms. Sheehan to come in real fast? And as that is going on, since I see Mr. Goring and perhaps other members of the Water Forum panel here, just a heads up that I don't believe we'll get to you today. In fact, I'm fairly sure we won't get you today. You are, of course, more than welcome to stay. But I didn't want you to, yes, have a donut hole or two, since you're not appearing. And Ms. Galen, Ms. Desjardins has 35 minutes to conduct her cross-examination, and then she is also, after that, will be conducting cross-examination on behalf of Ms. Seward for 15 minutes. And I guess I will wait until Ms. Sheehan comes in. The reason I'm asking for Ms. Sheehan, and perhaps when she does come in, one of you could talk to her about it. Ms. Morris has indicated when I first asked for a cross-examination of this panel that she might have 10 minutes depending on DWR's cross-examination, and I forgot to circle back to the state water contractors. All right, thank you. I just want to make sure we close that loop. All right.
Ms. Dodek, also I wanted to ask, my bird expert was obviously very interested in the testimony about, my bird expert testimony about impacts on birds. And so it may go longer than 35 minutes, but I'll try and keep it as efficient as possible.
I'm confused. Are you asking questions on behalf of?
I would like, yeah, I only asked for 45 minutes to begin with, and if I have a little bit more, I'd like a chance to ask the questions. I can let you know.
But you're not proposing to bring your bird expert up to do the
No,
cross?
he was very long. No, I'm not.
All right. Ms. Ainsley?
I just wanted to say that Ms. Morris does not want her 10 minutes of cross, so this will
Thank
be
you.
it.
We will cross that off my to-do list.
Okay.
All right, Ms. Desjardins.
Okay, my name is Deirdre Desjardins, and I'm a principal at California Water Research. And I have questions for Dr. Schilling on impacts of construction noise on birds, and I have questions for Mr. Robinson about traffic impacts. Mr. Schilling, I'd like to bring up your testimony, or is it Dr. Schilling? I'm sorry. Land 135, page 3, and line 19. And states the noise level considered as a threshold for birds and wildlife, the final EIR/EIS is 60 decibels, which is well above the threshold of 50 decibels in the literature and in a review carried out for Caltrans on the effects.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing that. Where are you? Okay, we were on a different page.
There we go. Yeah.
And Ms. Desjardins, let me request that you point Dr. Schilling to the line numbers that you would like him to read. Give him some time to read it if necessary, and then ask your question. There is no need to reread this.
Read this question. Dr. Schilling, so I wanted to ask you about the threshold of 50 decibels in the literature about impacts on construction noise on bird communication that you reference here. So that's a significantly lower threshold, correct?
Yes.
And this study, this review by Caltrans indicates it impacts bird communication.
Yes.
So is that communication could be used for mating?
Yes, it's used for mating and other kinds of communication between individual birds of the same species. Other kinds of communication between birds, individual birds.
If bird communication is disrupted, how would it affect the bird populations?
It depends on the type of disruption. If there's louder sound or a sound that interferes with birds' ability to hear each other, one of the primary impacts that's been studied is not being able to find a mate. So the obvious outcome of that is that you have a lower reproductive rate and a decline in the populations.
So I'd also like to go to line 25 on that page. You discuss that the method used by DWR for calculating noise propagation, that you found it inadequate and it did not correspond to even basic modeling approaches in GIS. So what was the basis for that?
There's two bases for that. Obviously maybe not obviously, but to understand how far away from a construction event or traffic that you have an effect on, in this case, wildlife. And if you have a certain level of loudness, let's say, you need to know what the initial sound level was. And I don't think that was done properly. And then the other, the maps that are shown in Chapter 23, Chapter 23 of the FEIR, the noise contours, they seem to represent a single and fairly simplistic condition. And as you change climate conditions and over complex landscapes, you don't have simple noise contours. And especially if you enter a built setting, you can get noise reflection, and so you have different attributes that aren't reflected in their representation of noise impacts.
Let's go pull up those maps. I'd like to go to Exhibit SWRCB 102, the final EIR EIS, and pull up Section 23A, which is the noise contour maps. I'd like to grab my distance glasses for just a second. So I'd like to scroll down to the next page, please. So these are the maps that you were discussing.
Yes.
And so what, like there's an area around Clarksburg. What about that do you think, if it was done properly, do you think that the areas affected would be expanded, or,
Well, first I would suggest using a different map, because this is alternative 1A.
Oh, let's scroll down to alternative 4A. Yeah. So let's look at this. This is alternative 4. So what about these noise contours do you think isn't correct, and what would be the impacts that you might expect?
Ms. Ainsley?
Compound, if you could just ask one question.
Apologies.
Sorry.
What?
Hold on. Hold.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Ainsley, was that the same objection or is it different?
I shared the compound objection. My other objection is asked and answered. He actually already explained what he found wrong about the contours and the propagation. He said that it was, in his opinion, the...
Hold on, Ms. Ainsley, let's not let you testify either. Sustaining the first objection with respect to compound, I am overruling the second objection. Actually, given the way Dr. Schilling's testimony went yesterday, I actually do appreciate revisiting this. So, Ms. Desjardins, break your question down and ask it again.
Thank you. So first, what about the calculation of these contours do you think was incorrect?
The extent of the contours, I think, is too small. Essentially, think of them as blobs of sound reaching 60 decibels A-weighted or 50 decibels A-weighted. And I don't think that those represent how far those levels of sound would go, because, and we'll see how this one goes, but if you back calculate what the sound volume would have to be to get those contours, you would find that it was approximately 100 dBA, or decibels A-weighted. And if you go into the literature, including Land 148, you'll see that the pile driver impacts for construction of the intakes, the cofferdams, et cetera, could have sound levels of 125 dBA, and the difference between 100 and 125 is many-fold. It's not a linear scale, it's a log scale. And so I would expect, and anybody could do this calculation fairly quickly, that with a higher noise level at the intake construction, the noise contours 50 and 60 would go past Clarksburg. Essentially, you would envelop Clarksburg and Hood with sound levels that exceed human levels of annoyance, and actually and health impacts, which are quite similar to birds, actually. So from a bird impact point of view, you would have the same kind of effect, where those circles really should be larger. The second thing that really caught my attention is how regularly shaped those are in a landscape that is not regular. And noise is absorbed and reflected in a fairly complicated way. But I did a noise model just to the east of that on 99, almost exactly in the same latitude, and it's a very we found very convoluted outlines of different noise levels. Think of them as contours. And so I would expect a similar finding here if the noise modeling was done adequately well, et cetera. I mean, there are free noise propagation models that could have been used. There are also ones you can pay for, either of which would give you a different outcome.
Thank you. I'd like to go to FSL 29, Appendix 5J, which you refer to. And page 18. So you refer to this exhibit. This is a list of species in the area, bird species.
Can you tell me where I do that?
You refer to that in on line page 3, line 25. You say.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And you refer to this. This is actually. And so there's a list of bird species there, including California black rail, clapper rail, et cetera. And so all of these species would potentially be affected if they were in the area?
Yes, but this is just a partial list of all the birds that live in the Delta.
Okay. And you think you, I believe, disagree with the area effect of 500 feet is from,
Yes, if we use the map that you just had up,
yeah,
the distance for a 500 dBA noise level, average noise level, was about 3/4 of a mile from the pile driver location, which is obviously more than 500 feet. And then if you think about the shaft constructions, which are the other areas going down through the delta, they also have their own different kind of noise levels. And in certainly in the case of the pile driver strikes, but generally the approach used of the LEQ, which is the averaging of noise, you're going to have noise events that go above that average, and those would extend beyond 500 feet.
so let's go to page 19.
Sorry
and
for that complicated
there,
answer.
this has, some of these has a footnote. Footnote 4 says, and it discusses habitat use in the immediate vicinity of construction activities is reduced. So you generally agree with that as the assessment in the footnote about habitat use in the vicinity being reduced?
Yes, generally.
But it might be more than just the the immediate vicinity based on your assessment of noise impacts?
Yes, and it also varies with, when it says some species, depending on how close you are, probably all species at some level. And then as you go further and further away and the noise gets less, then it's going to be fewer and fewer species, the most sensitive ones. And it doesn't really address the population level effects, which if you have long-term disturbance, just like people in, as we heard yesterday, people in Clarksburg may change their choice to live there due to noise. Birds are also going to change their choice to live there, their distribution due to noise.
I'd like to go to exhibit SOSC 18, which is a sandhill crane distribution map. Ask you about specifics. And I'd like to go to figure 5 on page 7. Let's scroll down. So this is a distribution of sandhill cranes on map C. Based on this map,
Hold on. Ms. Ainsley?
I would object. It lacks foundation. She hasn't asked him if he's aware of this study. She hasn't asked him if this represents his understanding of the distribution of sandhill cranes, nor if he's familiar with sandhill cranes before we actually interpret this graph.
All right, let's please answer those 3 questions. Dr.
Okay.
Schilling?
I have never studied sandhill cranes as separate from all birds as a group. I'm not familiar with this study or this map, but I'm familiar with how distribution maps are created.
All right, let's proceed on those premises.
but based on this distribution map, which you understand the concept of distribution maps, would sandhill cranes be affected by the noise impacts?
Well, I'll do a little geographic interpretation based on the county lines there, and certainly in the bottom map C, with the distribution occurring across the area of construction of the intakes, the shafts, the transmission lines, and the access roads, I would say yes.
Just based on this chart, not based on your own knowledge of sandhill cranes.
And I'd like to go to exhibit SWRCB 108. And this has to do with biological surveys. Page 25 at the bottom.
Are you familiar with this document, Dr. Schilling?
Yes, in the way that I'm familiar with the EIR materials in general. It was part of my reading in November to prepare my testimony, so we can start there.
It's just page 25 at the bottom.
Can we, I'm sorry, go
Let's
back
scroll
up
out a little bit.
so Dr. Schilling can see what this table is and
Yeah,
all of us
scroll
can
out.
see?
Scroll out. This has to do with surveys, and it indicates that the surveys may be conducted either concurrent with or prior to construction. If surveys for birds were done concurrent with construction, would that affect, would the noise issues you're identifying potentially affect the surveys?
Yes. And you would want to do it prior to and concurrent, not or.
You would want to do the surveys prior to construction.
And concurrent, so that you can
Prior
understand.
and concurrent.
And not or. It says or, which suggests that one could choose concurrent, which wouldn't tell you how things had changed because you hadn't looked at what had happened before.
Okay. And I'd like to go back to your testimony, page Exhibit Land 135, page 5, at line 10, about noise abatement measures. And you observe noise abatement measures are typically only partially effective.
Yes.
And you said it's due in part to poor connections between known impacts and legal requirements.
Yes.
And so I wanted to ask you about the noise abatement plan. I'd like to go to Exhibit SWRCB 102. Appendix 3B, which is the mitigation measures. And page 41. And
Do you mean
Next page.
PDF? What do you want? Or?
next page. There's a discussion. Oh yes, I'm at line 25. So it discusses a noise abatement plan as reducing severity of impacts. Are you aware? Do you know if that noise abatement plan has been defined yet?
I haven't seen it defined, but it sets a couple of standards here which may or may not work, and it informs some of the mitigations that occur on 2320, and so it goes back to was the predictive modeling of noise impacts done correctly? What's the standard for understanding impacts to people? And then is the monitoring done correctly? Those are all the ways to inform then what do you do about it. The abatement, as I said in my testimony, it's difficult to fully abate noise impacts, especially high sound levels that you would expect with a pile driver. And if the approach that they're using in the EIR is to use average noise levels in a situation where you have these big spikes in noise, then you may pull average noise levels down while still having that very characteristic pile driver strike sound occurring however often it's going to occur for those 30 million times that it occurs. So it's it doesn't suggest to me that this has been effectively addressed, and certainly the mitigation approach suggested on 2320 doesn't suggest that they've fully fleshed that out.
I wanted to ask you, at line 33, it talks about where residents complain of excessive nighttime noise levels. Noise abatement plan would call for noise level monitoring and reduction to a level of 50 dBA interior or 5 dB above ambient noise, whichever is greater. Would your observation about average noise levels versus spikes be applicable to nighttime noise levels?
Well, in this case, they're using the max, although the L indicates
L max,
that they're
I
not,
see.
well, L is, so that indicates they're using maximum noise levels
Okay.
versus average.
Okay.
But the parenthetical statement there of 70 dBA exterior, if they're only measuring exterior, the interior noise level actually depends on the construction of the house, the number of panes of window glass you have, the direction that bedrooms or rooms are facing that people are exposed to noise levels. And so that's a very high level of attenuation from 70 outside to 50 inside. And so if they're only measuring outside and they assume that the inside is reduced to a certain level without actually measuring it, then this would not be adequate monitoring. If they measured inside in the places that people were learning, living, et cetera, then that would be closer to adequate monitoring.
And for birds that were sleeping, what would 70 dBA exterior max?
Well, they wouldn't be sleeping. So, but it's again how far out that goes as to what size area would be affected, whether it would go into the wildlife refuge or riparian areas where birds were present, and definitely the timing. The fact that it's continuous day and night would probably displace any birds that were exposed to noise above a certain threshold that they were sensitive to.
And the threshold would depend on the species?
Yes, but almost all of them, when you get to close to 60 dBA, you start to push them out. Not all. Obviously, there are birds that live in cities, but for most of the species we're concerned about and most of the native species in the Delta.
So with that 60 dBA max or 60 dBA average?
That's max, but it's if it was max once a day, it's different from once every minute or so. So it's also the frequency that you get that kind of sound.
Okay. Thank you. So my next questions I have a few on traffic, and says I'd like to go to page 104 since we're on the development after, and it's the last paragraph, I believe.
Are you, Ms. Desjardins, are you trying to be in the final EIR or the developments after the EIR document?
It's exhibit SWRC developments after EIR. Am I still on the, oh no, I'm on Appendix 3B, that's why I'm not seeing it. Okay, let's go to exhibit SWRCB 102, Appendix 3B. Oh, we are on Appendix 3B. Let's go to page 31 of this document. Apologies. Which does discuss Go
31
to
or
the previous page. It was under barge, yeah. So this relates to, there's standard DWR contract specifications and traffic plans. Mr. Robinson, are you aware of these contract specifications?
Sorry, but I didn't follow what you were referring to. That's barge.
Yeah, there's, it refers to traffic plans required by DWR contract specifications. And
do
there's
you
a
have a
footnote.
line
Let's
number?
go down, on line 11 to 12. Let's go to footnote 12, please.
Okay, let's hold on. Mr. Robinson, do you see lines 11 through
Oh.
12?
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay.
let's scroll back out. And there, on the footnote on the bottom, discusses the contractors, at the very bottom of the footnote, it says contractors must develop.
Instead of reading
yeah,
it, let's
detailed
allow
plan.
Mr. Robinson to read the footnote.
Yeah.
And then when he's indicated he's done, you may ask your question.
Yeah, I read it. Mhm.
Okay, so, Mr. Robinson, the contract for the tunnels has not been signed yet, correct? Or are you aware of any contract for the
No.
tunnels? Are you aware of any traffic
Hold on,
plan?
hold on. Miss-
Objection, I'm not sure what he was answering no to, whether the contract had been signed yet or whether he was aware of the contract.
Mr. Robinson?
I'm not aware of the anything being signed.
Are you aware of
Hold
any
on, stop.
traffic
So
plan?
you are so you are familiar and aware of the contracts being discussed?
No.
So you're not familiar, you're not aware of these contracts, and you don't know whether or not they are signed.
That's correct, yes.
Are you able to answer any questions regarding these contracts to which you have no knowledge of?
Well, I guess that would depend on the question.
Okay.
Hey, has anybody discussed a traffic plan with you?
No, not other than internally among ourselves.
Yeah, you know, has DWR provided or discussed any kind of traffic plan for ameliorating traffic impacts of the project?
Not with the Walnut Grove Fire Department.
Okay.
Not with the Walnut Grove Fire Department.
And I'd like to go to page 39. Best Management Plan 12.
Let's allow Mr. Robinson to read it, and then you may ask your question.
Sorry, Best Management Plan 15 as well.
Yeah, I've read it, yes.
So, Mr. Robinson, this discusses potentially restricting all material hauling to off-peak traffic congestion hours, and minimizing to the extent possible uses of public roadways that would
You are
increase
reading the text
traffic
rather than
congestion.
asking Mr. Robinson your question.
Would this reduce, if this best management plan was actually followed, would this reduce the impacts that you're concerned about?
Ms. Ainsley?
Objection, best management practice. There is not a best management plan, so that
Sorry,
mischaracterizes
best
the
management
statement
practice.
in the
If this
document.
best management practice was followed, would this reduce the traffic impacts that you're concerned about?
Well, I'm unsure actually because I'm assuming they be work at nighttime, thinking about dark, bad weather, fog, and also these days a lot of produce is moved to market at night just for the temperature on the keep the temperature cool. So there'll be a lot of other trucks on the road at nighttime too, and a lot of with more grapes going in. There's a lot of more tractors moving up and down the road at night to do their applications. So I really couldn't say for sure.
Okay. That's actually, I would like to go to exhibit. Are you familiar with the final EIR, EIS statements after?
Not well.
Well, was something I would like. Could we go to exhibit SWRCB 108? And I'd like to go to page 104. And the last paragraph, if you could read it, please. Have you?
Do we need to
Could we
scroll
scroll
up?
up a little bit? Yeah.
So this says that mitigation necessary.
Instead of reading again your question.
So with respect to mitigation of traffic impacts requiring consent, cooperation of third parties, could that include local parties?
That's something that I can't answer. I don't know what's it referring to actually.
So as far as mitigation of transportation impacts on road capacity, requiring cooperation of third parties, you don't know who the third parties are?
No.
And are you aware of any discussion about with your agency or with the counties about trying to get that cooperation?
I'm aware of no contact between us, the county, or anybody regarding traffic mitigation.
Okay, thank you. That concludes my questions.
Thank you. Let's put 15 minutes on for Ms. Desjardins to conduct cross-examination on behalf of Ms. Seward. And we will take our morning break after that.
So I'd like to go back to Dr. Schilling's testimony, exhibit land 135, page 13. We could scroll out a little, please. Actually, I'm not sure I can find you said noise annoyance can occur at at lower traffic levels. At,
Noise annoyance for people?
um,
There has not been a question yet, Ms. Ainsley.
Okay, let's go to, I'm sorry, it's page 4 at line 13. It's,
Are you directing Dr. Schilling to lines 10 through 13? Or what specifically?
it's, we're at land 135, correct? And is this, oh, I'm sorry, his testimony, page 4, at line 13. There we go. And you just say, you refer to noise annoyance in this section, and you said it's been found to occur as low as 40 decibels.
Yes.
Would noise annoyance potentially impact recreational businesses?
Depends on what they are, yes. But for outdoor and quiet indoor, yes.
Like for campgrounds, marinas,
Depending on noise levels, yes.
wineries. And I'd like to bring up SHR 2-262, which is on the memory stick I gave you. And this is Ms. Sword developed this exhibit. Let's go down to the next page. And Ms. Sword, there's currently some construction on Grand Island, and
Are you aware, Dr. Schilling, of the island in question and what construction activities may be occurring?
I'm aware of it as being in the middle of the project area without, and the tunnel shaft and transmission line construction in that area and access roads.
let's just say with respect to Ms. Sward's business, which is labeled in yellow as Snug Harbor, Ms. Sward is concerned about traffic noise potentially traveling down and impacting her business, which is a campground and a marina. Yes, is it possible that you would get annoyance noise levels?
Objection, calls for speculation. He hasn't testified that he's done any studies of noise for the project purportedly going on Grand Island, and that he would know the levels of noise that that construction project is taking or the mitigation measures it might be using. So I think the whole thing calls for speculation.
I'm not asking.
Stop.
Yeah.
Dr. Frazier, to what extent are you familiar enough with Snug Harbor and the nearby islands to answer Ms. Desjardins' questions with respect to potential noise impacts?
From this map, I'm not familiar enough to offer an opinion.
Okay. Well, let's see. I would like to go to Chapter 23 of the final EIR on noise. Exhibit SWRCB 102, please. Yeah, and then Chapter 23. Page 15.
Are there any specific line numbers you wish Dr. Schilling to focus on?
Yes.
Enlarge it,
Starting
please.
on line 26, please. This discusses potentially constructing a temporary sound wall. Do you think, do you think that might be effective, or?
It depends how it's constructed, but typically sound walls are concrete or similar material structures, and they will reverberate and actually transmit sound and allow sound to propagate over them because of the nature of sound waves. So it depends on the height and the material. A sound berm, earthen berm, is really the only effective way to dampen noise from machinery and construction, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to go to section 23.2.3. At line 18, regarding local standards, it states that there were considered in development of thresholds, but they're only informational. So to
Hold on.
Yeah.
There's an objection to that last statement you threw in there.
Yeah, objection misstates what the document says. The document speaks for itself. The witness, of course, can read that sentence on line 18 to 19.
Sustained. Just ask your question. Ms.
Okay.
Adrian.
Local. So there are local noise standards.
Hold on.
In this area, correct?
Yes, let's make that a question.
Yes.
Does the final EIR indicate that the local noise standards will be followed?
No.
Does it indicate that they were considered for informational purposes?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's what it
That
says,
concludes
Ms.
my
Ainsley.
questions for Snug Harbor.
I was going to say objection is it's vague and ambiguous as to whether she's talking about the document as a whole or whether she's asking for the witness's testimony as to that sentence. So if she could clarify his
I
understanding.
believe she was asking for his opinion. And he offered it. Overrule, move on.
That's the end of my questions for Snug Harbor.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
we are done. We are going to take a break. And when we return, I believe, Ms. Osha, you have redirect?
Yes, just a couple of questions.
All right. We will return at 11:15. back, everyone. Ms. Meserve, please begin your redirect.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Sterling and for Mr. Robinson. And starting with Mr. Sterling, in your testimony, you refer to the figure land 120. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's on pages 4, 6, and 9 of your testimony. Is that right? Oh, is that on pages 4, 6, and 9 of your testimony? And if we could maybe go ahead and look at land 120, Ms. Galen. Is the purpose of referring to this figure to show the general layout of the project?
Yes.
And are you generally familiar with the geographic area of the Delta from living there?
Yes, I am. Lived there for 31 years.
And in your PowerPoint, you had reference to another exhibit. If we could look at DWR 1 corrected errata, page 7. Here it is on the screen. And this figure also shows an overview of the whole project, doesn't it, Mr. Sterling?
Yes, it does.
And from your living in the Delta and studying this project, are you aware of any major differences between land 120 and the figure shown here from DWR 1 corrected errata?
Hold on, Mr. Sterling.
Objection vague and ambiguous. Are you aware of any differences in the layout of the project? Is that the question? As opposed to just generally between the two figures?
The question is generally between the two figures. Is he aware of any major differences between the two?
I would object that is vague and ambiguous. If he has land 120 in front of him as well, one shows impacts and one shows the layout of the project.
Let's let him answer. Mr. Sterling.
Yes, I'm familiar with both of these maps or diagrams, if you will, and I have studied it for a long time, certainly since November when we submitted the written testimony, and it appears to me that the two are very similar in the way they're laid out, except 120 is more vivid and shows more than the one on that is depicted there, and that is why I chose to go with that one.
Okay, thank you.
No further questions. And then I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Robinson. If we could put up your testimony, Mr. Robinson, land 188, and look at the table on pages 4 and 5. And this table, do you recognize this table from your testimony?
Yes, I do.
And when you were working on your testimony, if we could look at another exhibit as well, which is from the final EIR, SWRCB 102, table 19-25. It's going to be in the transportation chapter.
Let's wait until we get it. Do you have a page number?
It's let's see, PDF 209. Do you recall studying this table from the EIR, Mr. Robinson, when you were working on your testimony last fall?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall looking through this table and looking for specific road segments that you were concerned about?
Yes, I remember this.
And this table includes maybe hundreds of road segments, but you picked just a few of them, is that correct?
Yes, the few that I thought directly impacted the Walnut Grove Fire Department.
And then are those the segments that were in the table on pages 4 and 5 of your testimony?
That's correct, yes.
And then if we could look, please, at land 123. And zoom out a little bit. Now, do you recognize this figure, Mr. Robinson?
Yes, I do.
And are you familiar with the road segments with the arrows on them?
Yes, I am.
And why are you familiar with those segments?
Because those are the segments that would have a direct impact on emergency services from the Walnut Grove Fire Department.
And are those the same segments that are listed in your testimony in the table on pages 4 and 5?
I believe so, yes.
And one last question. This is, I need to see, please, the final EIR, Chapter 19, page 11, page 19-11. And you were asked about the level of service referenced in your testimony for State Route 160, which is 1,740 vehicles per hour. And why did you think this level of service was unrealistic?
Well, that's approximately a car every 3 seconds. And in that area where we live and respond to, it would be hard to get that many cars going along the same way without any interruptions, any stop signs, change of directions, all traffic moving the same speed. In fact, that number is close to the number that's on Interstate 5 in Walnut Grove's response area, like Twin Cities Road, Hood Franklin Road. That's the, I forgot, where should I start from? Yeah, so on Interstate 5 on the chart, it's between, I think, Hood, Franklin, and Twin Cities, which Walnut Grove responds to. So that's I-5 traffic on a narrow 2-lane road that also has stop signs, curves, approaching and exiting bridges. You have driveways and roads that tee into these roads that people will have to pull out onto that traffic. So it's just, to me, it's just a theoretical, unrealistic number.
Do you think that number takes into account the actual condition that the road is in now?
Definitely not.
That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Meserve. Any recross? Any other recross? All right, Ms. Ainsley?
Hi, my name is Julianne Ainsley for the Department of Water Resources again. My questions are for Mr. Robinson. If we could pull back up his testimony, which I believe is Land 188. Oh, thank you. This is Land 188 errata, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, yesterday you told me that you did not prepare this chart. Is that correct?
It's correct. I went over the map and the volume of traffic on this other the other graph that was from the EIR, and then went over with somebody, with another individual and put these roads, he put these roads of concern onto this graph.
Who was that individual?
Nick Swenson
Who is Mr. Swenson, an attorney?
works for OSHA. I'm not sure he's an attorney or an intern.
Okay. And you now recall that that's the person who put this chart in your testimony?
Correct.
Did you write your testimony, Mr. Robinson?
Most of it.
Okay. No further questions.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time out of your lives to participate in these hearings and lending us your experience and expertise. I believe he meant that. And now, now we'll ask for panel 2 to come up, please.
Probably going to move down to where she is. I'm probably going to move to there. We'll have two witnesses. I don't know how you.
All right. Actually, I shouldn't have asked him to leave because I was going to ask now for estimates on cross-examination. Let's, before we begin, estimate of time for direct, please.
For Mr. Burke, the estimate is 20 minutes.
And
for
Mr. Nudek?
And for Mr. Nudek, I estimate 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, so that would take us to about 11, to a little bit past the noon hour. Cross-examination. You had estimated an hour, I believe, Ms. Ainsley?
For your estimates, I'd like to say at least an hour.
All right, and Mr. Shoshane, the always efficient and well-prepared Mr. Shoshane. Okay. Well, we will see how far we get, if at all possible. We will try to complete today so that you don't have to come back tomorrow. But a lot of that will depend on how much cross and any potential redirect and recross there might be.
I have an hour.
We are not going to be done with you today, if that is indeed the case. Right. We are not going to finish with you today. All right, with that, if you could both please stand and raise your, oh, Mr. Jackson.
I'd just like to reserve about 30 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Trochain, since you only have 5 minutes, we will begin cross-examination with you. Does that, okay. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? Thank you. Right, gentlemen.
Good morning, Mr. Burke.
Morning.
Is STWA 291 a true and correct copy of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
And is STWA 292 a true and correct copy of your PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, it is.
And before we begin, did you have a couple of minor changes you wanted to point out in your written testimony that you just noticed?
Yeah, as I was going through the testimony yesterday, I realized what had been posted to the board actually didn't match what we had in our review. It's just a few small changes. But for the testimony on page 2, the reference I had made to a biological resource that referenced the effect of salinity on aquatic species in the delta, that reference was changed. It's now a Hazenbaum, a reference that talks about delta smelt and the effects of turbidity and salinity on that species.
Ms. Ainsley, did you need clarification?
Yeah, I think I would need a full site. All that was there, but are we talking about page 2, lines 24 to 25? Is that what we're looking, the blank?
Could we pull that up, please, Ms. Galen?
Thank you.
I think I can clarify once it's pulled
WA
up.
291, page 2.
Page 2, line 24.
Line 4?
No, line 24 on page 2.
Okay.
Go ahead.
There is a placeholder for some testimony, or not testimony, but it references a resource from a previous process or hearing that didn't get removed. But Mr. Burke is now indicating that that resource, that exhibit, is not something that he struck that or would strike that through an errata with reference to that resource. So the Hazelbaum is not even something that is submitted at this point in time. So any reference to an exhibit at that point in time in this testimony would be stricken, and we've submitted a errata to remove that.
So my understanding is that the parenthetical starting in the middle of line 24, which does not end, maybe at the period, that citation is what you are omitting?
Yes.
And the deletion of that citation does not change the testimony that precedes it.
It does not change the testimony before it or after it.
I actually have a motion to strike, but I would be happy to bring that during my cross based on this reference and this paragraph. So I can leave it to the hearing officers when they would like to entertain that. But
let's wait until you're cross.
Okay. I motion to strike his testimony entirely.
And let's wait until I hear his testimony. All right. Ms. Sheehan.
Becky Sheehan for State Water Contractors. I'm a little confused because you said we're striking it, but then you made some reference to some other study, and I want to make sure there is no other study.
No, there's not another study that's going to be referenced.
So we're just striking it and nothing else, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Are there any other corrections?
Yes, on page 17, table 3.
Let's get to page 17.
There's a mean annual row at the bottom of the table, and that row for mean annual mistakenly was an average of the column, and it should have been a sum of the column.
I'm sorry, what?
On table 3 of the testimony, we have the salinity budget for different inflow and outflow points to the South Delta, and at the bottom of that table, there's a row called mean annual.
Yes.
And the numbers in that row mistakenly were using an average function for tallying that column for each of the different sources, and that should have been the sum of those columns, not the average of that column.
So, did you get that? It should be a total rather than an average.
That's correct. So it would be treated the same way as Table 4, which it is being compared to.
And are you prepared to submit your errata now, or shall we read what those totals are into the record?
I believe the errata has been submitted, if that's correct.
No, there's no errata submitted as we discussed. You can read the totals into the record. And
Let's read the totals into the record, Mr. Burke.
Okay.
So we'll start with the chloride column.
The chloride for the San Joaquin River at Vernalis, the mean annual is at 194,000. The total would become the mean annual because it's the mean monthlies that are being.
Are we still confused about something?
No, I believe we have the correct
Okay.
number. So for the chloride column under San Joaquin River at Vernalis, it should be 194,642. For the San Joaquin River at Burns Cut, the number should be 79,738. For the chloride under Middle River, the total should be negative 100,339. For the chloride value for Old River, the value should be negative 225,860,000. For the value for chloride under exports, the number should be 485,049. For the Contra Costa Water District diversions, the value for chloride should be 4,747. And for the total chloride, the last column in the table, the value should be negative 48,693.
Which is actually correct.
Yeah, that one was done correctly.
Okay. All right. Any other corrections?
On the PowerPoint presentation, that same table received that same change.
Okay.
And
Which
what slide is that, Mr. Burke?
Slide 7.
And with that, Mr. Burke, are you now prepared to summarize your testimony?
Yes, I am.
Please proceed.
I'd first like to go through the opinions that I've developed after going through this analysis. I've got 3 separate opinions. The first is that the operation of the
Mr. Burke, where are those opinions found? Are those in your testimony?
Yes, they're in my testimony on page 3 of the testimony. And I'm not going to read the full opinion. I'm just kind of summarizing what's in the testimony for the 3 opinions. The first opinion is that the operation of the WaterFix H3 Plus scenario will result in an increase in the amount of salt that's brought into the South Delta. The second opinion is that a review of testimony and exhibits by other parties in this matter indicate that an increase in salinity can adversely affect the fisheries and other biological resources in the Delta. And the third opinion is that a review of the petitioner's exhibits that have been submitted in this matter show that they have failed to take into account this increase in salinity. And now I'd like to go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint presentation. Which is Exhibit 292. we can't pull that up, I can kind of make reference to the pages of the testimony that reflect what's in the PowerPoint. Okay.
Do you need a hard copy? We have.
I believe I've got it on a thumb drive, if that would be helpful. I don't know if I put it in a PDF format or not. I would have to check.
Let's stop. Let's stop and see if we can find a version that will work. Yes. I'm thinking while we are trying to address that technical difficulty, perhaps Mr. Nudek might provide his direct.
We could do that.
Let's do that while we try to fix this.
That'd be fine, but I'm going to still need to have power or exhibits brought up. Is that going to be feasible during the course of the computer
Mr.
glitch?
Nudek, your PowerPoint is actually a PDF, so we should be able to do it.
Should be able to.
Oh, Ms. Galen is busy. Mr. Burke's PowerPoint was actually in PowerPoint format, but Mr. Nudek's is in a PDF format. And we're having trouble with PowerPoint. So, are you able to pull up the PowerPoint? Okay, so please pull up Mr. Nudek's PowerPoint, which is, I believe, SJC 315. That sound right?
Yes.
Yes.
And it is a PDF, so it should open.
So we're okay with that.
Yes, and I believe we are trying to download the PowerPoint, staff is, so we'll have that, Mr. Burke.
Good morning, Mr. Nudek. As you know, I'm Tom Keeling, counsel for the San Joaquin County Protestants. Take a look, if you will, at Exhibit SJC 291 and confirm, if you can, that that is a true and correct copy of your written testimony.
291 is my resume. 292 is my testimony.
Got it.
So just a slight correction on the numbering.
And
I apologize for interrupting, but I believe 291 is the written testimony.
that's what I
think
thought.
Mr.
Okay,
Keeling was correct. So for the purposes of
I
the record,
apologize. That's the number system I had, so it may have been shifted.
So 291 is a true and correct copy of your testimony.
Correct.
And Exhibit SJC 290 is a true and correct copy of your statement of qualifications.
Yes, and I apologize for the confusion.
Okay. Mr. Nudek, could you summarize your testimony?
Yes, I can. Good morning. As indicated, my name is Chris Nudek. I'm a principal with the engineering firm Kelson, Scenic & Nudek. We're headquartered in Stockton with offices in West Sacramento. I'm a registered civil engineer with 35 years experience, and notably the district engineer for over 22 reclamation districts. If we could pull up SJC 292. a picture of the Delta and the Delta reclamation districts within it, and the highlighted areas are the reclamation districts that KSN, which is the initials for Kelson, Scenic, and Newdeck, represent. There's 30 reclamation districts throughout the Delta region that my firm represents. 22 of those I serve as a district's engineer. We also represent over half a dozen outside the Delta region, mostly in the northern basin of the state. Some of the responsibilities of being a district engineer for these reclamation districts includes attendance of board meetings, development of operation and maintenance plans for both levees and drainage systems, for preparation of the subvention applications and claims, which is a state grant and reimbursement program, preparation of all the plans and specs and estimates for all their improvement programs, conductance of land surveys, response to flood emergencies, development of long-range goals, development of general plan review guidelines and encroachment control. We review all third-party encroachments such as pipelines, utilities, features that would be encroaching upon either the drainage or levee features of the reclamation district. And we also include review and preparation of engineers' reports and financial related matters associated with the Proposition 218 and development of the assessment roles to finance the operations within the reclamation districts. My testimony today relies upon two documents, the 2016 WaterFix EIS and the 2012 Delta Protection Commission Economic Stability Plan. My testimony is going to...
Do you mean the Economic Sustainability Plan?
Correct. Thank you for the correction. Economic Sustainability Plan is correct. My testimony today is going to focus on the effects of the WaterFix project has on the reclamation district works, which the reclamation district works in this statement is the levees and drainage systems within the islands in the Delta. It's notable to understand that Delta levees and drainage is a very complex arena. It takes years of experience. Issues such as soil types, shallow groundwater, peat foundations, subsided lands, and seepage are all some of the complex design challenges that we face in designing projects and implementing improvements to those regions throughout the Delta. Undertaking the WaterFix project will have a significant impact on the reclamation district's ability to perform what otherwise routine operation and maintenance and maintain the current level of flood protection throughout the Delta. This project has been denoted to be a 13 to 14-year project with an estimate of tens of thousands of truck trips throughout the region. I'm going to focus predominantly on the truck trips associated with the levee roads. This is an oversight, I believe, in the documentation associated with the transportation impacts on the number of truck trips. We routinely experience substantial levee subsidence and settlement when we put heavy trucks on our levee roads. This feature has not been considered when looking at the impacts. Most of the impacts have been the truck trips themselves and impacts to surface features, but not the subsurface features below the pavement or the gravel. So I'm suggesting that's an oversight. Settlement consolidation is an important element when you're talking about freeboard and talking about levee elevation when it comes to flood. This oversight's a critical impact in order for the reclamation districts to continue to provide protection, and as far as that goes, the economic stability of the RDs in the Delta. Most of the reclamation districts in the rural nature only maintain 1 foot of freeboard. So if we lose 6 inches to a foot, we're right down to the 100-year water service elevation. How often do we see the 100-year water service elevation? It's not once every 100 years. We saw in some areas of the Delta last year in the 2017 flood event in the West Delta, we did reach the 100-year flood. So if we were to consolidate and settle these levees as much as a foot, we could have some serious impacts to flood. There's areas also in the Delta that also have to give consideration to large wind and wave setup due to large bodies of water adjacent to the levees. That would be further impact. If I could have exhibit SJC 295 brought up, please. This is actually an exhibit, YouTube exhibit, that showed the barge offloading facilities adjacent to a levee system. And the purpose of this picture is to show the depiction of what a barge offloading facility looks like. It's a large dock feature along an existing channel. This construction will result in partial channel closures, and alternative 4 includes 7 of these offloading facilities. Not all 7 will have impacts, but several will. The impacts of these facilities could become critical during emergency operations, namely because we move a lot more marine equipment in the Delta during high flow conditions and flood conditions, because the damage associated with those events requires larger equipment and larger material sources. If I could pull up Exhibit 296. This is a picture of a typical, well, I'm going to strike the word typical because it's not typical in the sense that this is a break closure. We don't like to see these very often, but this is a 2004 Upper Jones Tract levee failure that they were closing. This is Dutra Construction, and they had 2 crane barges and 2 material barges, but it's a very typical setup where you have a crane barge, which is the enabling equipment, moving the material from the adjoining material barge. The width of this setup is anywhere from 80 to 110 feet. If you put that next to an offloading facility, you'll see that the impacts could be substantial in navigating up and down the stream in the Delta, streams and the sloughs in the Delta. Not only will these temporary offloading facilities potentially impact and block marine access, they may also have an impact associated with flood flows. As the flood flows develop and water comes up onto these, there will be likely eddies that occur on either upstream and downstream end of these. There's a potential for erosion of our levees that hasn't been addressed associated with these new projections within the live channel. If I could have Exhibit 298 pulled up. This is not representative of a condition where we have a structure in the channel, but this gives you a condition of an eroded bank. This is an extensive eroded bank. You can see the levee top and so forth. But if you had a situation develop where you had high flows adjacent to an obstruction in the channel, you could get eddies that form downstream and upstream that could create this kind of erosion. Moving on, levee strength and stability.
Hold on, please.
Certainly.
I am following along. I have a similar objection to Ms. Meserve yesterday. I would object to any additional explanation or detail embellishing the conclusions and testimony in his direct testimony. I don't believe he provided explanations of eddies and hydrodynamics of the channel. I'm looking where he's talking about 298 on page 7, line 16 to 19. So at this point, I don't think it's too far afield from the direct testimony. I'm only actually putting it in as a caution that I do object to testimony that strays too far from the direct testimony.
So noted. Do you understand, Mr.
Well, I understand. Would you like me to respond to that?
Nope.
Okay.
She is just
giving
giving us all the warning.
Okay, that's fine.
Especially you.
Well, and I understand. I sat through yesterday's hearing, so I'm pretty familiar with the
And I'm sure you
line
do
of
not-
objecting. I'm
you
trying
do-
to stick as close as I can to my testimony.
Perfect. Thank
I'll do
you.
my best. In addition to the comments made to this point so far, levee strength and stability is a constant concern within the reclamation district realm in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Excuse me. A constant concern of reclamation districts in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I previously mentioned the subsidence and consolidation, and I just recently mentioned the erosion risks. In addition to that, there's a number of other elements that we're concerned with. They include seepage, both under and through the levee, critical failure surfaces, seismic risk, regional climate change, and sea level rise. Seepage through a levee is a concern of ours, and it's becoming much more substantial in its overarching consideration with regards to how we address strength and stability. This is where water passes through a hydraulically conductive layer, sand, for instance, and exposes itself on the back slope of the levee or at the toe of the levee. This can lead to internal erosion and ultimately levee failure. If we could pull up exhibits 304, 305 and 306, and I'll just walk through one at a time rather quickly. This is not going to take long. 304 demonstrates that this is related to seepage out of the channel. If we go to 305, these are 305 and 306 are both pictures of an adjoining flood channel and then the adjoining seepage. In the lower picture, you'll see that there was actually boils created with sandbags placed around them. If we go to 306, this is another one. Here, I actually have an urban setting where the water is actually passing out into the streets of the neighboring urban area. In addition to concern about seepage, this is the general static stability of our levees. Static stability versus dynamic stability. Dynamic is earth movement associated with an earthquake. Static is just generally as the levees stand there, how do they maintain and stand up to the forces, hydraulic forces associated with the water next to them. Ways by which we repair and maintain and improve are to flatten the levees' landside slopes, widen the toe berms, add fatter toe berms, etc. Whereas seismic activity currently is not really truly being addressed within the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta rural levees. This has not been a high priority. We have not seen in the history of the Delta region any substantial impacts associated with any seismic events yet, and it's not as a high a priority. Yet, when we do the work to maintain static stability, such as widening, flattening, and adding toe berms, we are in effect addressing some of the seismic concerns. In addition, we have the issue related to climate change and sea level rise. This will cause the districts to remain vigilant and continually raising their levees to provide the adequate flood protection. Obviously, the subsidence of settlement due to the truck traffic will impact this element as well. If I could pull up Exhibit 307. This is just a picture, and this will lead into my discussion here beyond this, of all the seismic events here in the last, I think it's 20 years, or maybe it's longer than that, I forget the actual reference, but the reference is substantial in the nature of the number of the magnitude of the seismic events in the region. As you see, majority of it's on the coastal range, very limited to the western fringe of the Delta, but it gives rise.
Hold on.
I'm sorry, this is cited in the testimony at page 10, lines 13 to 14. I acknowledge that this is an exhibit. The exhibit supports a statement that districts are aware of the seismic risk. I did hear the witness say that, but now the witness is expounding on the different types of seismic risk and the number of events or the location of events, and I believe that is beyond the scope of his direct.
Hold on. I'm on page 10.
I'm sorry, you can go to lines, roughly the lines aren't totally matched up, but it's line 13 to 14 where he is citing SJC 307. It's bolded.
All right. And your objection is?
My objection is that he began well enough saying, you know, districts are aware of the seismic risk, which is what it says in the direct testimony. He puts up the exhibit, but now he's expounding on the seismic risk itself by explaining data shown in this graph and what it means to, I suppose, the reclamation districts that he represents. And so now he is adding testimony about locations and magnitude. I'd have to go look at the rough transcript, the real-time transcript, but now he is adding detail about that seismic risk that is not in his direct testimony.
But he is referencing the chart, and apparently, I mean, you've had time to look at the chart and if the graphic, and if he's just explaining what's on the graphics, I'm confused about your objection.
It's fine. It died. I just testimony about particular locations on this map that were of interest. He was getting more technical. I'm happy, since I don't have the rough or the real-time scrolling at this moment, to let him proceed, but I do have an objection on what he was just saying as to the content of this map, and I believe he's going to add more.
We will proceed like we did for Dr. Schilling yesterday in terms of keeping track of your objections. Mr. Nudek,
Continue.
continue, but again,
Okay.
be cautious.
All right. That's fine. I can conclude on the elements associated with the earthquake map for the time being. Additionally, through my experience in operating and maintaining levee systems, in the 35 years of this career I've had, I've seen over 6 major high water flood events. It's in my opinion that the imperative that the WaterFix consider the potential impacts of the levee risk associated with the entire alignment of the tunnel system throughout the neighboring districts and the tunnel route. Delta levees are part of an overall integrated system and must be maintained as a system. Risks in addition to those mentioned that I previously mentioned in my testimony include seepage from flooded islands. This is a new concept that wasn't raised earlier. If I could have exhibits 308, 309, and 310 raised. This is what occurs when we have a flooded island in the Delta is we get interconnected seepage from one island to another island that actually commits.
They have the exhibit up.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Thank you. So speaking to the actual exhibit, what occurs during a flooded island in the Delta is these interconnected channels and interconnected lenses actually communicate water from a flooded island over to a dry island. This has the potential for adding instability to the adjoining leveed system in with regards to the seepage that's occurring. If we turn to exhibits 309 and 310, I have, actually,
Noise annoyance.
okay, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Not you. Was it you?
Oh, no. I wasn't. I was looking at my notes. I
It
apologize.
was Mr. Stroshane, I believe.
Okay. These are just some quick pictures to show seepage from the Jones Tract flood event, the most recent major flood event in the Delta. You can see in the foreground both lower and upper Jones that are under about 15 to 20 feet of water, and how that seepage propagates over to the west, in this case, Woodward Island. This is seepage that occurred within a week's time of the original flood event occurring. If you turn to 310, the same can occur.
Hold on, Ms. Ainsley.
Again, for the record, I'm lodging an objection that he's going beyond the scope of his direct in providing testimony about the event on Jones Island. Yes, I did see the pictures that he had just flashed up, but the depths, the implications, that is not in his direct testimony.
So noted.
So that this is all a standing motion to strike.
Understood. Mr. Nudek, please continue. I have a question. Is there a reason you're not using your PowerPoint? All of this is on your PowerPoint.
Yeah, I apologize for the form and format of it. I was trying to summarize and only pulled off, a number. I didn't pull off all of my exhibits. I was told to reduce it to 15 minutes, so if that works.
I was only asking because Ms. Galen was trying to open all these documents, and they're all on your PowerPoint.
Okay. This next one is, again, in the foreground. This is Lower Jones in the foreground, and McDonald Island. You can see where their seepage has occurred and the system of trenching that they're trying to do to obviate that and correct that. On 310, correct. Thank you. Okay, as I indicated, the seismic impacts and the seismic risk as it relates to rural delta levees is not a priority and is generally not considered in our work plans at this point. But yet it still is a real risk in this region, and we understand it to remain a risk. We just don't have the current funding by which to expense that onto our improvements. Yet a seismic event of substantial nature could have an impact to the tunnel system. If we could pull up exhibit 311. This is a quick depiction of the head conditions at the Sacramento River at Clarksburg and the head conditions at the Clifton Court forebay. So these are approximately 39 miles or 40 miles apart from one another. And as we all recognize, this is a gravity-fed pipeline that has head in it. In other words, gravity head to push the water to the south. If we had a substantial enough seismic event and the proposed tunnel were to rupture and the ground above it were to rupture, that water could escape and could actually flood the ground above it. In addition to the impacts associated with the testimony to date, there's additional impacts affected by potential increase in delta salinity and loss of farmland. This is in reference to the Delta Protection Commission's Economic Sustainability Plan. If this reduction, as stated within the 2012 Economic Stability Plan, were to be as substantial as stated, which was $20 to $80 million per year for the potential increase in salinity, and $10 to $15 million associated with crop losses and the potential for losses of farmland with regards to the construction of the facilities, that would result in a $30 to $95 million loss to landowners within the Delta. Being a representative responsible for raising funds to do the levee work within the Delta, this would have a substantial impact on the assessment ability of the reclamation districts to continue to operate and maintain their levee systems. As a matter of history, I've been involved in numerous pipeline crossings throughout the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I've experienced in jack and bore, directional bore, earth pressure balancing, and these are all tunneling methods. We've had routinely been able to solve these problems, but we've had some pretty critical near failure conditions throughout this, and I'm doing this to demonstrate the challenges that one has in doing tunneling. The first one was on Shima Track. We had a 50, this is not 50 foot, this is a 50 inch, so something less than 6 foot diameter bore crossing Mosier Slough. Mosier Slough, the pipeline intersected the channel bottom and flooded out the bore pit. Byron Track, this was for Los Vaqueros, this was a 72 inch diameter bore. The bore pit machine settled as soon as it left the jacking pit or the boring pit and started to, the trajectory was to the bottom of Old River. They had a 9-month event to back that machine up and solidify the ground with which it was crossing at the early stages. The reason I raise this is to demonstrate boring in a soft, non-homogeneous soil, which is what's underneath the Delta, is very challenging, which places the Delta systems and the WaterFix at substantial risk. In summary, I think this project must consider the ongoing condition of the Delta levees and the long-term maintenance and operation of these leveed systems, and how this project will affect those systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Galen, have we worked out the situation with respect to Mr. Burke's PowerPoint? Excellent. Let's pull that up. Let's put 20 minutes back on the clock, and Mr. Burke, with apologies for the technical difficulties.
Oh, no problem.
We'll
I
now
should have given
turn-
you a PDF.
Yep.
Good afternoon. My name's Tom Burke. I'm a principal with the firm of Hydrologic Systems. I've got 37 years of experience in water resources projects across the country. I've got a master's degree in civil engineering with a specialty in water resources engineering, and I'm a registered licensed professional engineer in California. I've got 12 years of modeling experience in different water resource projects in the Delta, and for the last 3 years, I've been working exclusively or extensively with the DSM-2 model to evaluate hydrodynamic conditions in the Delta and water quality characteristics that accompany the water flow within the system. Next slide, please. The WaterFix project primarily consists, or the main element of the WaterFix project consists of the 2 twin tunnels taking water off of the Sacramento River and converting it.
If you could get closer to the microphone, I'll move the microphone closer to you, yes.
And diverting it down to Clifton Court Forebay. Now, this type of diversion, because the Delta consists of a network of interconnected canals, will change the hydrodynamic characteristics of all the system because they respond as a system together. So what we wanted to do was determine, based on this new diversion that's occurring and the new equilibrium that would be set up, or quasi-equilibrium between the Delta channels, how is that changing the flow patterns within the South Delta, and how is it changing the delivery of salt that accompanies that flow into the South Delta? So we developed a water, or not a water budget, but actually a salt loading budget for the South Delta. A salt loading budget allows us to look at the different sources that are bringing salt into the South Delta and the different sources that are taking salt out. We didn't evaluate the dynamics of what's happening with the salt within the Delta or within the South Delta area that we're defining for our budget, but we evaluated the net inflow of salt and the net outflow of salt for the no action alternative as well as the preferred alternative for the WaterFix project. Next slide, please. This map above shows a general delineation of the South Delta area that we were evaluating for this salt budget. As you can see from this area, there are basically 7 different inflow and outflow points. We've got the San Joaquin River at Vernalis down at the lower right-hand corner of the map, and north is up on this map. We've got the San Joaquin River leaving the South Delta area on the upper right-hand side of the map near Burns Cut. We've got Old River and Middle River discharges leaving the South Delta, as well as an export of the Contra Costa Water District. Down on the left-hand side of the project, we also see the 6th and the 7th components of the budget, which are the State Water Project exports and the Central Valley exports. For the water budget, we used a DSM-2 model that was run through an 82-year period of time. We actually didn't use the full 82-year period for our analysis. We excluded the first year of the model run because it takes about a year for the model to actually get up to a quasi-equilibrium condition with the natural dynamics of the delta. So over that 81-year period, we looked at the daily salt inflow and outflow from the South Delta area, and then averaged that over into monthly values to evaluate how that salt is changing or accumulating or leaving the system over a period of time. The DSM-2 model is not going to provide an actual salt estimate that we can get, but it's great, as been described by Dr. Nader Tarani earlier. It's a perfect environment for evaluating changes and between 2 different scenarios. And so what we did is we evaluated the salt budget that we got for the no action alternative to the same conditions for the preferred alternative. Next slide, please. The nature of the DSM-2 model provides salinity estimates in terms of electrical conductivity in microsiemens per centimeter. What we want to do in order to determine what the salt budget is to convert that electrical conductivity, which consists of many different ions and salts that are in the water, into just a chloride concentration in milligrams per liter. And you can do that by taking actual measured data that's been collected near each of our discharge and inflow points and creating a relationship between the electrical conductivity and the chloride concentration from these laboratory analyses that were conducted on numerous samples over the last 20 years. And what we have up here is a plot of the relationship between electrical conductivity and dissolved chloride in milligrams per liter. We've got electrical conductivity on the x-axis and dissolved chloride on the y-axis. And this relationship is for the San Joaquin River near Vernalis, taken with data that was collected between 1951 and 2015. This particular relationship has an R-squared, which is a coefficient of determination of 0.96. And the R-squared is basically an indication of the quality of fit of a relationship to the data that's used to develop that relationship. So based on all of the data points you see, that dashed line showed the relationship that we used in our analysis for converting electrical conductivity to dissolved chloride at that particular location. Next slide, please. This is another sample. I'm just throwing 3 plots up there to show the typical samples of what we had for converting electrical conductivity to dissolved chloride. This particular plot is for Middle River at Borden Bridge, showing the relationship again between electrical conductivity on the x-axis and dissolved chloride on the y-axis. For this particular relationship, we had an R-squared of 0.94. Both this 0.94 for this location and the 0.96 that we got for the San Joaquin River at Vernalis location are quite good ability to fit. Next slide, please. This last example figure is for the Sacramento River at Sacramento. Again, we have electrical conductivity on the x-axis and dissolved chloride on the y-axis. And for this particular relationship, we had a coefficient determination of R squared of 0.84. We took this relationship to convert all of the electrical conductivity on a daily basis from the DSM-2 model into chloride mass on a daily basis for each of these 7 different locations of inflow and outflow to the delta. We summed those up over those monthly periods to come up with a total salt mass in metric tons. And we summarized that by month, mean month over the 81-year period that we evaluated the data for. And next slide, please. Could you actually skip this slide and the next slide? We'll come back to those. It'd be better to start off with the explanation and then go to the detail. What we have here are the different months that we evaluated the salt budget for, and the 2 columns to the left of that are chloride concentration or chloride total in metric tons. The first column should have a title of no action alternative. That's the NAA total. And the next column is for the preferred alternative and its total. And again, you can't compare the actual tons, but what we're doing here is using DSM-2 and QUAL in a comparative analysis to look at the difference that we see. And so, for example, that first line, for the mean January period over the 81-year period of record, we're getting a reduction in the amount of chloride that's leaving the South Delta, so we're getting an accumulation of basically 4,400 metric tons on average for a January period. If you work down through the different months, you'll see for February, we're accumulating salt within the South Delta at about 2,600 metric tons. Now, some months will be larger and some months will be lower again because this is just an average over that period. But we created that average for each of the different months and then looked at the mean annual average at the bottom of the column. If you total all those up, you'll see that on an annual average, you're accumulating basically 30,000 metric tons in the South Delta based on the inability of the preferred alternative to remove chloride fast enough or as fast as the no-action alternative. And the primary driving force we found behind this had a lot to do with a reduction in exports. As the South Delta builds up salt salinity within the water column, the exports that we're seeing now in the no-action alternative remove a lot of that salt from the South Delta. As you reduce those exports, you're no longer reducing that salt that's within the South Delta channels, and that salt is going to be building up. We can go backwards now, 2 slides. I'll briefly go over some of the details without confusing people too much. This is a breakdown of each of the different 7 sources that we evaluated salt inflow or outflow from the South Delta. This is a mass balance, so basically you have...
Let me interrupt to make sure you designate what slide we're talking about now.
Oh, okay, this is...
Back up too, but why don't we identify the slide?
I believe this is slide 9.
Are we sure? It's on page 7.
I guess it's slide 7 then, I'm sorry.
Is the slide on the screen the one you want to be on the screen, the correct one at this point in time?
That's correct. This is the breakdown by source for the mean monthly average salt budget for the no-action alternative. And since we're looking at a budget, we need to subtract the outflows from the South Delta from the inflows. So basically, the inflow to the South Delta is primarily the San Joaquin River at Vernalis. So that's the inflow from to the South Delta. We then subtract all of the other columns that we see there from that San Joaquin River at Vernalis inflow. That would be the San Joaquin River at Burns Cut, because it's leaving the South Delta. We got the Middle and Old River, which would be leaving the South Delta, and exports and the Contra Costa Water District diversions, which are all leaving the South Delta. Now it comes to a point in nomenclature of sign convention with this analysis. If a number is positive, that means the water is moving in the downstream direction towards the bay. If the number is negative, it's moving in the upstream direction. So, for example, Middle River looks confusing because it's an outflow from the South Delta, but yet it has a negative value on many months. That negative value means it's actually contributing salt to the South Delta, because you've got a lot of reverse flows that are occurring, and you've got, through tidal action, flow that's coming into the South Delta. And so if you look through each of these columns, and this is where we needed to make that correction, the mean annual value at the bottom of that column is the average of those months, and it should have been the sum of those months. And so that would be the number that I provided earlier for these particular locations. And so if you look at each of these sources and you look at the mean annual for all of these months, the net annual reduction of salt coming from the South Delta is about 48,000. Now, this is not an actual value because we are not taking into account the internal dynamics of what's happening to salt for irrigation, seepage, drainage, all those features. What we're just looking at is what's coming in versus what's going out. What happens to it once it's in the South Delta is another factor altogether. But what happens inside the South Delta is the same for the no-action alternative as it is for the preferred alternative. So those conditions are identical. So both salt budgets can be compared on an even basis because there is all the different quantities are being accounted for correctly. And so could we go to the next slide, please? This is the breakdown for all the different components for the preferred alternative. Again, on this bottom row is the mean annual, which is the sum of all those. This one was done correctly. And as you move across the table all the way to the lower right-hand column, you'll see that there's a negative 18,000 metric tons that are being removed from the delta. Now, it's not actually appropriate to say that it's being removed from the delta. That's not correct. What it is it's the residual in the salt budget from the inflow to the outflow. So the residual for the preferred alternative is 18,000. The residual for the no-action alternative is 45,000. Next slide, please. And the difference between those two numbers is what we have here in this previous table that we looked at down in the lower right-hand corner. Actually, it's a 48,000 minus 18,000. Just wanted to double check that number. And if you go to the next slide, please. This is a plot, a monthly plot, showing the difference in the salt budgets between the preferred alternative and the no-action alternative, looking at the change in the residual. So this is what's the difference between the preferred alternative budget and the no-action alternative budget on a monthly basis. This plot here is just what's been plotted up from the previous table. So it's just a graphical representation of that summary table that we just looked at. And as you can see, in some months, on average, you're getting almost a 7,000 metric ton increase in salt as a difference between the preferred alternative versus the no-action alternative. So this would be an accumulation on average for that particular month due to the WaterFix project. Next slide, please. So in summary, my analysis of the hydrodynamic and water quality data contained within the petitioner's model, all of this analysis used the petitioner's model that was submitted and is on the website. We didn't change anything, we didn't add anything to it, we just used the petitioner's own data to sum up this data for the South Delta area. It's my opinion that there'll be a significant increase of salt loading to the South Delta, basically accumulating around 30,000 metric tons of salt on average within the South Delta that will then be incorporated into the salinity of the water column. And we showed that in the data that we presented in part one of this hearing, how the salinity levels will increase in the South Delta. And then it'll also increase the salinity that may be used for agricultural or municipal uses in the Delta. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burke.
I just had two clarifying questions for him for clarity. Mr. Burke, you mentioned numerous times the preferred alternative. Can you confirm what you're referring to when you say the preferred alternative?
when we were developing this budget, the preferred alternative was the BA preferred alternative. We've been looking at the California WaterFix H3 Plus alternative to see if it differs significantly from the BA, and we haven't completed that analysis, but our initial indications are that it doesn't change significantly from what we see here in the BA preferred analysis.
Ms. Ainsley?
I'm going to object at this time that testimony is beyond the scope of his direct, that he has provided an opinion now as to CW. I understand that in his testimony it's the BA-H3+. He's now providing an opinion based on an analysis that I understand may be draft that's not submitted here on CWF-H3+, and I think that specific part is beyond the scope of his direct.
Well, Mr. Ruiz, any response?
No, my concern was just for him to clarify what this particular analysis was based upon.
And
I think
so he
that.
did, and we'll strike the latter part of his answer based on Ms. Ainsley's objection.
Last clarifying question, and Mr. Burke, the underlying premise of your analysis, the reason that you did the salt loading analysis is based on your understanding that potentially salt loading in the South Delta could have an impact on aquatic resources or habitat, correct?
Yes, I've looked at different exhibits that were submitted and listened to testimony from other parties. And in the biological assessment of the project, it talks about salinity having an influence on increased mortality of fisheries within the delta, and increased salinities can also create additional stress on fisheries resources and lower their probability of survivability.
Ms. Ainsley?
Again, I'm going to move to strike. He is asking a clarifying question, but it's testimony beyond the scope of his direct testimony. Going back to the page on which he struck the reference on page 3, he's now asking him basically to provide testimony on what other parties he was referring to. He's basically, he's not clarifying anything in the direct. He's actually asking for more details.
Mr. Ruiz,
I didn't ask for more detail, and it's actually page 2. I just asked him what his premise was based on his understanding that increased salt loading in the South Delta could have an impact on aquatic resources. That was my question.
And
my
your
answer is
answer?
yes.
And that last question, that's not based on your review of any particular document or material, including the one that was referenced in your testimony with regard to the previous Bay Delta process, correct?
That's correct. It's based on numerous pieces of information that I've looked at in my experience in the past working in different water resource projects within the Delta.
And you're not rendering an opinion as a fisheries biologist or any with regard to any specific impacts on fisheries?
No, I'm not.
Thank you.
Did the clarification help?
And when we get to it, I have a couple suggestions for cross-examination and my motion to strike.
All right. Thank you. Does that conclude your direct?
Yes.
It does.
Thank you. All right. Mr. Trochain, let's let you ask your 5 minutes of questions first. And as Mr. Trochain is coming up, Chair Marcus apologized. She actually has been called to testify before the legislature, but she will catch up on video, and I'm sure she will enjoy that very much.
Can I ask a point of clarification? Is our hard stop at 1 or 1:30? I forget. I'm sorry. I just forget personally.
You know what? Let's revisit after Mr. Trochain completes his cross-examination. Ms. Womack.
Yes.
Hold on.
While we're setting up, I'd like to be
Oh,
added
okay.
on to the, thank you.
How much time?
I guess 45 minutes?
Mr. Trochain.
Very good. I want to also, before I start, I want to thank the hearing officer, Ms. Dodek. Oh, it is on. I will speak closer. Is that better? Okay. I want to thank hearing officer Dodek for the accommodation of allowing me to go first.
Actually, selfish motives on my part. I want to encourage everyone to be as efficient as you.
My questions are all for Mr. Newdeck, excuse me. Thinking of the jazz pianist, I guess.
No
Mr. Newdeck, is it your testimony that there are several types of risks?
Closer to the microphone,
Oh,
please.
I'm sorry. Mr. Newdeck, is it your testimony that there are several different types of risks to delta levees during the construction period of the petition project?
Yes, those risks exist throughout the year and certainly will exist throughout the construction of this proposed facility.
Okay. In your professional role and judgment as the chief engineer for many delta reclamation districts, are there risks to delta levees, either physical or other types of risks that concern you during the operational period of the petition project?
From my testimony, the operational aspect risk that I mentioned was the potential for a tunnel rupture, which would lead to some concern from a upstream to a downstream condition if it was at the very low end. Operationally, the only other element would be associated with the economic sustainability study, where they mentioned the potential reduction in revenue generating capability of the reclamation districts, therefore less ability for the RDs to perform routine maintenance and operation and improvement projects in the future.
What is the source of that potential, or sources of that potential reduction in revenue generating capability?
That element is, my opinion, if we were to have that substantial of an impact, the $30 to $95 million impact in the Delta, these reclamation districts operate on budgets less than $500,000 a year. So, and there's only about 60 reclamation districts within the Delta region. So the math works out pretty quickly that you're not going to have enough money left to finance these, because generally the revenue generating capability comes from the farming aspect of the reclamation districts. And if they don't have that ability to farm and generate revenue, they won't have the ability to pay their landowner assessments.
Are there other sources of revenue to the reclamation districts?
There is, and there is from the standpoint that the state of California has currently a program to reimburse the Delta reclamation districts for levee maintenance and operation as well as improvements. That's under consideration for continuation this year. It sunsets this July, but that's a program where we get reimbursement revenue, up to 75% reimbursement revenue on money spent to encourage the ongoing operation and maintenance of the system.
Is it, you mentioned the 75% level. Is it fair to characterize this as a significant source of revenue to reclamation districts in the Delta?
It's not it's a reimbursement program, so it's not really a source of revenue. So you spend the first dollar and hope that the program is not oversubscribed, and then you get up to 75% 18 months thereafter. So it's a reimbursement program. I don't know that I would characterize it actually as a source of revenue, as rather a reimbursement of expenses, but it can end up being substantial depending upon the level of work that the district does.
Thank you for clarifying that.
You're welcome.
Is continuation of the DWR levy subvention program, don't go to sleep now. Pardon me. Is continuation of the DWR levy subvention program a priority for you and your district clients for continuation? Or I said that. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. I sit on a number of organizations that helps lobby to continue. We work with the department to try and encourage them. We work with the governor's cabinet to encourage them. The program has been one of the most successful programs the state has ever managed, with the outcomes being what they are. We've prevented flood events here in this last series of high waters in 2017, nothing like we've done in the past. So it's been earmarked as one of the most successful programs they've ever conducted, and we'd like to see it continue. It's not a very expensive program. The levy subventions program is a $12 to $15 million a year. I reference it as budget dust. I've been criticized for calling it budget dust, but I construe that to be a small number when you look at the number of improvements that are made premised off of that reimbursement program.
That's actually a new phrase I hadn't learned yet, budget dust. Yeah.
I was criticized by a ex officio for saying that.
In your experience with Delta reclamation districts, have there been any proposals from state or other agencies that would reduce levy subventions to the districts and which have caused you concern?
Currently, right now, the only state entity that is troubled with the continuation of the program appears to be the Delta Stewardship Council. And they have some recommended changes, not all of which we're familiar with. We know some of those. And that's the only state agency that's outspoken on its continuation. We've presented before the state legislature the past 2 legislative years. Last year, 2017, it was vetoed by the governor at the 11th hour. That was 2016. 2017, it was put in the suspense file. We're not exactly certain what entity is causing it not to allow the continuation, but there is some issues and elements that we know that the Stewardship Council would like to see improved with the program. Yet they do support the continued 75% cost share.
If the maintenance subventions that you've been describing here for Delta levies were reduced and levy deterioration and or failure ensued, in your professional opinion, in your role with the reclamation districts and taking into account water quality and supply, would DWR and the Bureau lose incentive to continue diverting fresh water at the South Delta diversions if they could rely on North Delta intakes of the California WaterFix to replace them?
My professional opinion, not testified to, but absolutely. Absent water quality, absent the levied systems, the water quality at the southern diversions will be non-existent. We'll have a salinity problem there. And therefore, the reliance of the northern diversion would become much more substantial. So maintaining the levees in their current configuration, maintaining the channels and the manner with which the water moves in the delta is imperative to maintain the water quality at the southern diversions. Absent that continuation, we will likely end up moving towards a northern diversion unto itself because we will not have the quality at the southern diversions.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shoshain. All right, Ms. Ainsley, let's bring you up. I am going to suggest that we hear your objection, motion, whatever, with respect to Mr. Burke. I'm sure we'll hear also from Mr. Herrick and Mr. Ruiz on that matter. And I'm going to suggest that we do not start your cross until tomorrow, because otherwise we'll be breaking it in half, unless you have a shorter cross for Mr. Newdeck that you could complete within the next 10, 15 minutes.
I do have a shorter cross for Mr. Newdeck. I think I could look at the clock once we stop the motion to strike business, and then I could give you, it might be very close, I'm just hesitant.
All right, let's go ahead and hear your motion.
My motion requires me to ask a couple quick questions of Mr. Burke, like 3 questions, and then I bring my motion to strike.
All right, let's do that.
Good morning, Mr. Burke.
Good morning.
If you recall, my name is Julianne Ainsley. I represent the Department of Water Resources. So let's look at page 2 of your testimony, SDWA 291. And we are going to, oh, excuse me,
Hold on, Ms. Ainsley.
and scrolling up to page 2. Right there. So in your testimony, you state that the reason that you're preparing this analysis is for other parties' use. Is that correct?
No, I didn't say I was preparing this analysis for other parties' use. I was saying I was preparing this analysis based on indications I've seen from other parties' testimony and exhibits that salinity can be an issue.
Do any witnesses for the South Delta Water Agency et al. Group rely on your testimony to draw conclusions regarding biological impacts?
I would have to refer that to my lawyers to determine how they use the analysis that I provided them.
Are you aware of anyone at all in Part 2 using your analysis to draw biological impacts?
And no, I'm not.
So you are not able here today to demonstrate the relevance of your testimony to Part 2 hearing issues in this proceeding?
No.
Objection. That misstates.
Hold on.
Objection. That misstates his testimony, lacks foundation, argumentative.
Ms. Ainsley, ask your question again.
So you don't know the relevance of your testimony to any other protestant's testimony regarding biological impacts on the WaterFix?
I'm not sure how much.
Hold on, Mr. Burke. In your opinion, what is the relevancy of your testimony to the key hearing issues before us in Part 2?
I believe the relevancy of the analysis and the testimony I provided is based on my understanding of the sensitivity of aquatic species and fisheries to salinity increases or salinity changes within the delta. And so I wanted to determine whether or not those salinity changes in the delta were significant and what those values were. Were they increasing from the WaterFix project? Were they decreasing from the WaterFix project? How were those salinity values changing? Now, I would leave that up to a biologist or a fisheries expert to determine whether that's a significant impact or not.
Because you yourself cannot make that determination.
That's correct.
Are you aware of any other parties in Part 2 who will be relying on your analysis to make that fishery impact connection?
I haven't had any communication with other parties in Part 2 to determine whether or not they were going to be using my analysis in their presentation or evaluation.
Thank you. Hang on, let me turn back to Ms. Ainsley.
All right, and so my motion to strike is this. Mr. Burke has provided hydrologic testimony regarding purported salt loading impact, but there is no connection to a biological impact in the South Delta presented by any other witness. This is testimony untethered from the issues of Part 2, which would be, I'm assuming, unreasonable effects on fish and wildlife. So this is testimony that's going into the record, but has no demonstrated relevance to any other parties, or his own party more importantly, but does not have any biological relevance because this witness is not competent to make that connection. And we have checked, no one relies on this testimony. So it's basically, it doesn't have demonstrated relevance, and it's basically just adding into the record information that is not at this time being used.
And you don't believe the issue of salinity loading is of public interest?
I'm sorry, this witness does not cite that as a basis. This is the South Delta, and I am not aware of anyone using this testimony in public interest to make a public interest argument as well. As far as I know, no witness relies on Mr. Burke's testimony in making a point relevant to Part 2 hearing issues, specifically as well to what he is naming here, a biological impact. So it is untethered from anyone else's connecting testimony.
Mr. Herrick.
Well, that's not the standard. We're hearing a petition to change a point of diversion, and it's up to the petitioners to set forth certain things and show no injury and go through analysis of impacts to public trust. Mr. Burke's testimony deals with a change or a potential change or an estimated change resulting from the project. At the end of this proceeding, if nobody else references or talks about this issue, then perhaps in argument, somebody might say, well, then you should ignore that. But it is testimony that deals with potential impacts and impacts that were not examined by the petitioners. They may put on a rebuttal case, they may do something, but the testimony here is submitted to show that here is an impact deemed significant by the person who did the analysis that may affect public trust and fishery, which are public trust uses. So there's no basis for saying it has to be stricken. The relevancy determination by petitioners is irrelevant to whether or not it's information that might be useful to the hearing officers. There's no basis to say, I don't like it, or they should have shown something else. That's not objection.
I will come back to you, Ms. Ainsley. Mr. Ruiz, any additional?
No, I would just emphasize that at a minimum, it's relevant to public information, public trust, public those issues at a bare bones minimum. I mean, we've had a whole panel of testimony yesterday, the day before, from a Westlands group that doesn't even allege an injury. So at a minimum, it's a public information. It meets that at the bare bones minimum. And if parties later want to argue about the weight of it, then that's fine. But as far as striking it, that's just baseless.
Ms. Meserve.
I would just add that part 2, it has the hearing issues are quite broad, as you've indicated, and include the public interest. So the testimony that Mr. Burke has provided may also be relevant to other public interest considerations that are at issue in part 2, such as impacts to agriculture, the economy, tourism. So in addition to fisheries, so I think it's as Mr. Herrick described, that it's up to others to use or not use the testimony, but as far as being relevant to part 2 issues, it's well within the scope of what was defined as part 2, and it's not necessary for Mr. Burke to define how exactly it's going to connect up with other hearing issues, in my opinion.
Ms. Desjardins.
I wanted to add that the arguments cited by Mr. Herrick and Mr. Ruiz and Ms. Meserve have precedent in Calhoun v. Baylor, 9th Circuit, 1980, 626 F. 2nd, 145. And this is the precedent for considering admissibility of evidence in administrative hearings at the end. In that case, there was hearsay evidence that could be corroborated during the course of the hearing. And I argue that this is a perfect example whereby this may be relevant to, very relevant to key issues considered. He is correct, there isn't current biological testimony, but clearly salinity is relevant to fisheries, and for that reason I would urge that it not be stricken. Thank you.
Mr. Jackson.
We will be using Mr. Burke's testimony if it's admitted in both Bill Jennings' testimony in regard to what the different operation will be between the existing situation, which brings water into the delta, and from the Sacramento River to control salinity in the South Delta. And that's a public interest issue for everyone in the South Delta. It's a fisheries issue in regard to the fact that if the South Delta becomes a place that has more salt and selenium coming from the San Joaquin because of the lack of water coming across, the fisheries habitat is going to be reduced extensively. And I think the witnesses for CSPA who are going to be using this information in their public trust complaint or their public trust argument, and their unreasonable effect on fish and wildlife argument, and their public interest argument, were encouraged at the start to try to consolidate as much of the information between parties who were protestants as possible. This gentleman is a recognized expert in this area, is providing information which will be used on rebuttal, and it will be, I cannot remember everything that was said by my clients and my case in chief, but the issue of whether or not the change in point of diversion from north or from south to north is going to affect public trust assets given the scope of this project, seems to me that we will use all of the evidence we can get that is within this, the framework of this hearing in order to prove our case under the actual change in point of diversion case law. And so I would suggest that you wait until the end of the process and see how this gets used.
You cited Mr. Jennings'
Yes.
testimony, for example. To your recollection, did Mr. Jennings refer to Mr. Burke's analysis in the direct testimony that he submitted?
Our problem with that is that the unlike part one, we all had to submit testimony at the same time. So no person, probably on either side, has been able to use other people's testimony because the November 30th date of simultaneous testimony made it impossible to use other people's testimony. It wasn't yet created.
If I remember correctly, in part one, the only people that submitted testimony earlier were petitioners.
Yes, and we did use the petitioner's testimony.
But your answer to my question then, Mr. Jackson, is that, to your recollection, Mr. Jennings, for example, did not cite to Mr. Burke's analysis in his testimony.
I think both Mr. Jennings and Dr. Fred Lee cited to testimony over the last 35 years that Mr. Burke had done. We did not have the advantage of seeing his work for this particular presentation because of the filing deadline.
All right, thank you. Ms. Womack.
Suzanne Womack, Clifton Court. I am in the South Delta. We get our water from the river. Dr. Burke, I appreciate your testimony because, and I will use it where I can. I need to study it more because I can't afford that, and I can't drink salt water, nor can the people that live at Clifton Court. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Womack. Ms. Ainsley, and then I believe Mr. Derringer might have a question or two.
I do have one comment.
Mr. Keeling.
Beyond the obvious, which is salinity loading is clearly an impact on public interest, and we all know that after 2 years. This hearing has been a mosaic of testimonies from literally hundreds of witnesses, recipient and expert. There has not, to my knowledge, in any written ruling or any ruling from the bench, been a ruling to the effect that an individual witness must, upon threat of having his or her testimony stricken, be able to link up that testimony, sometimes narrow, sometimes wide-ranging, with that of other witnesses. If at the end, and Mr. Herrick alluded to this, if at the end of the day, nobody's linked up salinity loading in the Delta to a cognizable injury, either public interest or species, then Mr. Burke's testimony would be exactly what the tunnels will be if they were ever built, a stranded asset.
Strike that, Mr. Keeling.
Well.
All right, Ms. Ainsley, your response?
Yes, I've been trying to keep track of the various points. I would say first to Mr. Keeling that we are not saying that there is a rule that other parties must use testimony provided by different parties. What we are saying is that under Government Code 11513, there must be demonstrated relevance to a hearing issue. It is not proper to take testimony and submit it for the hypothetical or potential possibility that someone may find it useful at some point in the proceeding. What we're looking for here is demonstrated relevance of this testimony to a issue before the hearing officers. And what I'm hearing are attorneys giving you public trust resources that may be implicated, or giving you biological resources that may be implicated. But what I'm saying is that this very technical testimony, which has a specific result for the South Delta, no one uses that testimony to link it to the public trust impact, whatever that may be, whatever these attorneys have testified to, or to the biological impact that this witness, who is not a biologist, thinks it might be useful. So I do think it is improper to admit testimony on the off chance it might be used at some point in this proceeding. I think that it is the party's duty to demonstrate the relevance of their testimony and to link it up to the hearing issues for the hearing officers.
Mr. Derringer, you had some questions?
You asked my question.
Oh, hey, I'm a good attorney. Mr. Herrick.
If I may, I would just say in conclusion that we keep talking about things that don't matter, that aren't the rules. It's not the thing. The hearing officers heard testimony just now that the project will result in increased loading based on this analysis. Whether that's true or not, that's up to other people to decide. If the hearing officers don't think more salt in the South Delta is somehow related to any hearing issue in this part, that's up to them. I think it's clear that it is, and when I get to the end of this process, the briefing that we produce will certainly argue that increased salt in an area that has the problems we went over in part one not only impacts legal users, which gets back into the wrong part, but also applies to the issues you're examining in this part. Those issues are public trust issues. And whether anybody thinks that's a lame argument or a strong argument or a disjointed argument is irrelevant. The increase in salt is relevant to this proceeding.
All right. Thank you. We will take that under advisement. We will issue our ruling when we reconvene tomorrow. Ms. Ainsley, I will ask you to continue your cross-examination tomorrow. Where will we be tomorrow? We're back in Coastal. Thank you. We're back in Coastal at 9:30 in the morning. Oh, not yet. Ms. Meserve.
I had missed the other opportunity. I want to reserve 20 minutes for questions of this panel, please, for Group 19.
Group 19. All right. That's all. Thank you.